video, I want to talk to you about how important it is to control the stereo field of your track. I'd really recommend that you use a good set of headphones to check out this tutorial, or some decent studio speakers. They'll do the job just fine too. So when it comes to creating a mixdown, we're looking for really three core things. We're looking for clarity, we're looking for separation, and we're looking for balance between our sounds. We spoke earlier in a previous tutorial about the frequency spectrum and how there are certain limitations to frequencies. There's a top end and there's a bottom end, below which and above which you can't really hear, the human ear can't hear. So those are our limitations. When it comes to volume, there's only so much volume you can funnel down to a single stereo output before you just get horrific distortion. Same with any individual channel. If you simply turn it up too high and you start redlining, your sound is just going to turn to dust. It's going to be horrible. When it comes to stereo content, it really pays to think in a similar way to that. So if you imagine you have limitations, you have an extreme left and an extreme right to your stereo field. Anything beyond that, and there is the capacity to kind of go beyond that by really exaggerating your stereo content. But once you effectively do go beyond that in terms of the way that you perceive that sound, it starts sounding incredibly unnatural. Now, to demonstrate this, I have a loop here and we'll just give it a quick listen. I'm going to use Voxengo span to monitor what's going on here in the mono and stereo parts of the sample. Now, a mono part of the sample just means that there are certain sonic elements that are identical in the left and right hand side of the stereo field. At the same time, you can have other elements that are different in the left and right side of the stereo field, different from one another, and that is really the definition of stereo. So it follows that a sound can have both at the same time. For example, a hi-hat sound could be in mono, but the reverb from it is very much in stereo. So this Voxengo span plugin here, which is free to download from the Voxengo site, shows me how much stereo and mono content there is within the part. And it also shows in orange when the stereo content in terms of level exceeds that of the mono content. Let's just give this a listen. Now what we're looking at here in the darker green is the mono content, and in the lighter green the stereo content, and then the orange, as I just said, is the excess of stereo content above the level of the mono. Now this particular sample, as you can see, particularly in the high end, it has a lot of stereo content. Within Ableton there's a super useful tool that I don't think people maybe use enough, but it's called Utility. And it's a simple, basically gain control, but it also allows you to exercise some control over the stereo field, and that's super useful. It has this mono button here, which allows you to simply convert everything that you're hearing to mono. So if we just listen to the sample and then click the mono, now you'll probably notice that when I force things into mono, force this sample into mono, we actually lose quite a lot of the high frequency sounds within this loop. And part of the reason for that is a lot of that high frequency sound is in stereo and it's now being summed into mono. So we're suddenly getting a real decrease in the top end of the sound. And that's really changing the character of the sound. So it's really important to periodically, especially with very wide stereo sounds, it's really important just to do a little head check sometimes and use this mono button just to check that when it is summed into mono, that you're not losing a bunch of different frequency characteristics of the sound. Now let's take that back. Now 100% width here, you see this width controller, 100% width is the standard amount of width of your sample. And very usefully here we have a lot of control, so we can actually dial in, so we can reduce the amount of stereo content simply by reducing the width of the sample like this. And actually when we get to about 70%, I'd say, to my hearing anyway, it sounds like a bit more of a natural sound. At 100% it sounds slightly exaggerated and a little bit uncomfortable. Now we can also exceed 100% on this control, and you can actually jack this way up to 400%, and this should give you some idea of just how uncomfortable an excess of stereo can sound in any given sound. You can see that that sound has now almost completely fallen apart from itself. It now feels like all of the different elements are somehow disconnected from one another. Now if you imagine that you're piecing together a track and you're trying to get all of your sounds to sound like they actually belong in the same kind of sonic orbit as one another, having too much stereo content is potentially just going to pull the entire thing apart. So it's actually quite a dangerous thing to do when you're getting into the mixdown stage of just, thinking that you can make the mix slightly more exciting by just jacking up some of the stereo width on something, because you will not only be changing the sonic qualities of the sound, but you could well just end up having a mix where your different elements just start falling apart from one another. Another thing to bear in mind as far as the stereo content of your track goes is contrast. So there's no better way to emphasize stereo content within your mix by having certain elements in mono. And obviously it's just a contrast thing. You have maybe a couple of hi-hat sounds and a kick drum and a snare, and they're bang down the middle of the mix. All of a sudden your pad sound sounds lush and wide, and it has its own bit of real estate here within the stereo field to occupy. One final thing to bear in mind as far as the stereo content goes, and one area that is super important to control, is the bottom end of your stereo field. Now, coming back to our example here, our rhythmic example, if we just look at the spectrum analyzer here, we can see that on the left hand side of the screen here, this is where we see all the bassy information, the deeper bass information, the sub bass stuff. You can see that this sample actually contains a whole ton of it right down here, and this information down here is creating it's eating up a huge amount of headroom. And headroom is going to be super important when it comes to balancing all of your parts and ensuring that you have a really loud and clear mix. The other thing that these bass frequencies are doing is ultimately they are going to end up clashing with the sub bass and some of your your low mids and deeper bass parts within your track, and that is going to make those bass parts sound less and less clear. Now imagine you had 4 or 5 rhythmic parts and they all had this kind of content going on down in the stereo field especially, but certainly in the frequency spectrum, you're going to end up with a mix that just sounds like mush. So that's really it for me as far as controlling the stereo field goes. I would just really urge you to think hard about how wide you want the sound to be. Would it be better off used as a mono sample in order to create some contrast between the stereo content and the mono content? And also, going back to our very first tutorial in the series, think about the role and function of the part. Think about what it actually needs to be doing and what it's offering the track. And then think about whether that particular part might be better served shaving off some of the stereo content as opposed to adding extra stereo content. If you've enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to the YouTube channel. And also, why not check out my website at mixingmasteringmentoring.com, where I offer one-to-one mentoring sessions as well as mixing and mastering services. You can download a PDF cheat sheet of the information contained in this tutorial from the link in the description below.